Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire, and I hope you are all doing well and healthy. Today I'm sharing with you a really fun partial die cutting technique that allows you to create partial die cut frames. For this, you just need some sort of frame shape, a circle or label or frame, rectangle, whatever die you have, along with a coordinating die to a stamped image. I have lots of examples for you as I'm making as many cards as possible to give to nurses, grocery store workers, and so on. So you'll see multiples along the way, which is good because it shows you many variations. I'm going to start out with a more complicated, technique version, but then I will end with a simpler version. So just stick with me. And I think if you're a stamper and die cutter, you probably have some supplies that would work for this. Let's start with this set of cards here. If you look closely at the flower, you can see that it's one piece with the label die. So that whole flower image and the label are all one and smooth, and that's the technique we're looking at today. The stamp set that I used is one that I've been wanting to use for a while now. It's from Altenew. It's one of their Build a Flower sets. That means that this stamp set is one that you create by layering things together or building images together. And it comes with a coordinating die set sold as one. There is like a little idea booklet and layering guide included, which is really helpful. I really like the design of this particular set. For this card, I'll also be using the Altenew nesting label dies, which I've used before. These dies also have an inner line right inside the cutting edge that creates an embossed edge, so it makes it extra special. So I have one of these label dies and the coordinating die for the large floral image from the set that I showed you. I want to create it so that the large floral is right down the center and the label die is in the center too. So I'm taping those together. I'm not going to run them through the die cut machine this way. I'm just going to trace them with a pencil. This will help me plan everything out. You can try skipping this step, but I'm telling you, it really is a time saver and makes this technique much easier. So I traced it quickly with the pencil. It doesn't need to be accurate. You really just want to have a rough idea of where the dies will be. We will want to cut the flower die above the label die tracing and below the label die tracing. Then we'll want to cut our label die to the sides of the flower tracing, which you'll see here in a moment. Let's start with the flower die. I've lined it up with our pencil lines and I'm putting it into our die cut machine. Any die cut machine would work. And I'm making it so that our top cutting plate lines up with the pencil lines and where they meet with our die. Okay, so see right there where the pencil line for the label die hits our flower die, and then over here too. So I'm going to make it so my cutting plate meets those 2 points. Anything under the cutting plate will cut. Anything hanging out to the right won't cut. So I'm just cutting the top of our flower, any area that is outside of the pencil label die. Okay, so I'm running that through and you see how just the top cut. Really quick and easy to do. I'm going to do the same with the bottom. So I'm putting the top cutting plate so that it lines up with where the pencil line from the label meets the edge of our flower die. So I'll line up the edge of our cutting plate with that and run it through. I've done this with electric machine before, but I just find it easier to demonstrate with a manual machine in the video. Okay, so we have the top and the bottom of our flower cut. We don't want to cut the center because it would cut through the label area. Now we're going to cut the label area on the sides. First, I'm going to erase my pencil lines. I like to use my Creative Detailer tool. This is an electronic eraser that quickly removes it without damaging the paper. Okay, so now I'm lining up our label die with the pencil outline that we created earlier, and I'll tape that in place. Any temporary tape would work here. This time we're cutting just the sides of this. So I'll grab my die cut machine again, get that top cutting plate so that it covers up the left side of our die, of our label die, only up to where our flower cut. So see where the flower cut meets the label die? That's where we're going to put the edge of our cutting plate. And then we'll run that through. So that cut the left side there. Now we're going to flip it over and do it to the other side. Again, putting the top cutting plate so that it meets the 2 points where our flower cutting edge meets the label die. It doesn't have to be exactly to it. Doesn't have to be perfect by any means. It'll still work nicely. Even if you have a nice little ledge on your cutting plate, don't worry about it. What you end up with is one piece, this floral die cut with the label as a part of it, which is really cool and gives a nice smooth, professional look, and you just stamp your flower on it. If you find that your partial die cutting lines don't connect, that means that they're all still connected a little bit, you can just snip it with your scissors to complete it. It usually takes a small snip and you end up with that one die cut piece that really looks cool. Okay, so now I want to make more of these. You don't have to do this if you're making one card, but I wanted to make multiples. So I'm taking the negative space of the one that I just created, and I put it over a piece of white cardstock of the same size, and I'm tracing those important edges, the ones where the edge of your flower die matches up or meets up with the edge of your label die. After I trace those, I'm going to pop my flower die in place, remove that negative space, and now do the same process that I did before. The reason that I lined it up with the negative space of the last one is this way I will end up with die cut pieces that are exactly the same, so that I can stamp on them all in the same position using a stamping tool, which you'll see in a moment. If you're only making one or two cards, you could just do the process I already showed you the one or two times. But again, I'm making multiple cards right now. So I'm doing the same process as before. I'm lining up the edge of my cutting plate with where the pencil line meets the die that I'm using, and then running it through. And that cut the top and the bottom of the flower. Now I'll again do the label die. This is the same process as before. So I'm lining up the negative space from before with the piece that I just did some partial die cutting on. This time I'll pop in the label die. So I'll just kind of pop it in. It feels kind of like a puzzle piece that fits in perfectly. Then you can remove the negative space, which I had put a cut in. You see that cut on the top right? It just helps it to pop off easier or kind of slide off easier. Hold the label in place while I do that and then tape it down. Then we can do the partial die cutting on the left and the right of the label edge. So I'll show that one more time just so you can make sure you got it. I'm going to line up the edge of the cutting plate with where the flower cut line meets the edge of my label die. So you can see how that's lined up there. Run that through, then I'm going to rotate it and do the same on the other side. And again, we'll end up with a label combination flower die cut shape. That'll be just like the last one we did, so we can stamp on them in the same way and make multiple cards quickly. Off screen, I went ahead and repeated this process 3 more times so that I ended up with 5 partial die cut frames. You kind of get in a rhythm and it goes fast. Okay, now it's time to add our stamping. I have my Hero Arts black MISTI stamping tool here. Any stamping tool would work. And I have a negative space from one of the die cuts that we just created. On the back of the negative space, I'm putting some tape just so that I can pop a die cut in there and it'll stay in place. I do use a little bit of anti-static powder tool on it so it wouldn't be as sticky, so I can easily get the die cuts in and out. Now I'm lining up one of my die cuts. I want to be sure that the floral part lines up, the top and the bottom. Don't worry if the label doesn't fit perfectly. I must have shifted a little bit each time I did the technique. Doesn't matter. We just want to line up the outline image of that flower with the top and the bottom of our die cut. I then stamp this with black Obsidian pigment ink. Any black ink would work here. I like this one because it stamps crisp and dark. So I then take this die cut out and I can stamp this on our other die cuts. Now I wanted to make each die cut a little bit different. So I did a couple in black. One I ended up doing in a light gray ink, and then some I skipped the outline completely. That's one of the nice things about the layering stamp set that I'm using today, is that you can use the outline or skip the outline. It doesn't matter. So you'll see both. This time I decided to use the light gray ink. This is Altenew Crisp Dye Ink, and I used the Silver Lake color. I ended up stamping it twice just to make it a little bit darker. Now it's time to add the colorful layering to this, and I'm going to start with the leaves because it'll be the same color on all of my frames. So I'm starting out with the first layer of the leaves, and it's very easy to line up because these images fill in the outline that we've already stamped. So I'm going to list up in the top corner the different color combinations I used just so that you can see what worked for me here, but you definitely could use whatever inks you may have. After I've stamped on the first one, I can go ahead and pop in the next one and continue to stamp all of the bottom layers of the leaves. Now, I had mentioned that on some of them, I was going to skip the outline. Here's an example. So I'm just going to stamp the leaves here and build up the colorful layers. But I know it all line up nicely because I'm using the outline as my guide to get the placement just right. Okay, so now I'm going to go in with the next layer of the leaves and stamp with a slightly darker color of green. And I'll do that for the third layer of the leaves too. I'm not going to show all of those steps because it's pretty easy to follow, especially since there's a layering guide included with the stamp set. Now it's time to stamp the flowers. So I'm starting with the bottom solid-most layer of the flower and I'm lining it up with the outline image. This I'll stamp with my lightest color. I'm going to use, I think, 3 or 4 different color combinations here, and I have them listed on the top. I wanted to have a variety of cards. I think I did 2 yellow, 2 blue, and then a pink and a purple. But I basically just want to start with my lightest color and then build up to my darkest color. So you'll see how easy it is to pop each die cut into the negative space and end up with the great lining up of my stamping with that frame die cut around it. Now, I know it takes a bit extra time to do multiple images like this at once, but I find 3 big advantages to doing it. One is you get more practice. Layering gets easier the more that you do it, as does stamping. Number 2 is you end up with more cards that you can send out, which I think is always a good thing, especially now. And the third thing is you can try out different color combos and find out what works best for you with the inks that you have. So I encourage you to give it a try. Here are the different combos that I ended up with. You can see some of them have outlines, some of them don't. All have different looks, and now I know how best to use this stamp set in the future. Okay, now I thought I'd have some fun with the background on this. This is a very subtle thing that I'm going to do here, but it's a pretty cool technique, and I thought I would just go ahead and share it with you. Notice how the scallops on the top of my card go one way and the scallops on the bottom of my card go the other. This is another partial die cutting technique that you can do with background dies that just gives you a different look to whatever die you have. The background die that I'm using creates tiny little dots in a scallop pattern. It's Altenew Dotted Scales Debossing die. So if you look at it, all the scallops go in the same direction. I thought I'd change it up to make it go one way on the top, one way on the bottom. So I'm only die cutting half of the background die. See how only half of it is underneath the plate? And I'll run that through. Now I'm going to rotate the die and put it back up against the paper, but it's upside down. So I've rotated my die around. Now I'm going to put the cut part that hasn't been cut under the cutting plate. What I'll end up with is the pattern going in one direction on one side and the other direction on the other side. It's a really small, minor detail with this particular die, but say you have a die that has a really dominant pattern or cuts out different areas, it can completely change up the look of your background. So here, check it out. You've got the scallops going upward on the top and downward on the bottom, and they meet in the middle, creating a new pattern. Doing things like this doesn't make a big difference on the final card that I give to somebody, but it makes me feel better because I'm stretching the products I have. Okay, so now I just glued everything together. I'm adding 2 more label dies to the back of the one that we created, just for some dimension back there. And I'll put foam tape behind the flower pieces at the top and the bottom. On the card, I also added a darker color cardstock strip that's matted with white, just for a little finishing touch. Now I needed a bunch of sentiment strips to add to these cards, and here's a trick that I like to do when I want to create several that are the same. I'm starting with black cardstock, and I have my sentiment lined up with the top. I'm stamping it with VersaMark ink, and then I'm going to shift it up 1/4 inch in my MISTI stamping tool, which is about a good width to have your little sentiment strips. I'm just following the lines on the grid on the background, so I just move it up 1 square each time and stamp again. Sorry my head gets in the way, but it's best to look from above to make sure I'm moving about 1/4 inch each time, 1 grid square. So I stamp a bunch of these, so I have a row of the same sentiment stamped many times. Can't see it because it's VersaMark ink, but then I add white embossing powder and heat set it. Once I have those heat set, you could continue to do more if you wanted, I'll start trimming them down. So I trim the sides first, and then I just start cutting each of these, and they're each 1/4 of an inch long or wide. So I just move 1/4 of an inch on my trimmer. So over there on the left are little 1/4 inch marks. Each of the little squares is 1/4 inch. So I just move to the next one and cut, and move to the next one and cut. And then I have a bunch of sentiment strips ready to go. I usually make extra, so I have some in a little bowl for other cards. Now I used some of those sentiments I just created, which were from this stamp set that I showed you earlier with the flowers. Then I used an older Altenew Thinking of You for some of the others. I created all those Thinking of You sentiment strips from the same method that I just showed you. So I added that to the cards, and then I used a glitter pen just to add a little bit of glitter in the shadowy parts of the flowers. I just wanted something to catch the eye and decided to skip on any gemstones or sequins. So here is a look at the different cards that I ended up with. I really like the yellow because I felt it was such a cheerful, sunshiny card. And you can see here that I have colorful inks for the flower and also a light gray outline. And I like that subtle look. It gives it a bit of definition but lets the colors shine more than if I use black ink. Here's a comparison between the two. So on the left I use light gray outline ink, on the right I use black outline ink. I like that it completely changes the look with that one simple change. Everything else is pretty much the same. Next we have the pink version, and this one I didn't use any outline. So this is just the colored layers building together to form the flower. Notice in the background how we have the scallop going in both directions, using that partial die cut trick that I showed you earlier. Here's the purple version, which again, I used the light gray outline ink for it. And then I have two blues. One has the black outline like you see here, and then the other I skipped the outline. So you can see that by doing that partial die cutting technique with the frame, that piece in the center is one piece. Now you could totally have stamped the flower, die cut it, and then put it on top of a label die cut and get a layered look. But there's something special about this continuous look, and I enjoy using my products together in creative ways to get something a bit different. Okay, my next set of cards uses partial die cutting, but this time I'm going to do it with a flower coordinating die and a circle die. So you don't need to have any fancy frame or label dies. Circles work great. I'm using the Altenew Ornate Foliage stamp set, which was on my favorites list. This is really cool because it has that beautiful outline, but then images that build in to color it. So it's not particularly layering, but it just makes it quick for coloring. Instead of using markers, you just stamp to fill it in, and you can really change up the look very easily. So I have the coordinating die for the large image and a large circle die. I want to make it so that the floral die hangs off the side of the circle, and I position the dies together so that I can trace around them. This just helps me to know where I need to do my partial die cutting. Now this die is a little bit different because of the detail and how large the flower is. So this time I'll have to do 3 steps instead of 4. My next example will be even easier. Let's start by cutting the flower on the left side. So all of the flower outside of the pencil circle. I can't do that in one pass because part of the die will cut in the center if I try to connect it all. So I'm going to cut the top left portion of the flower, then the bottom portion. So I'm going to go from that top point where the pencil circle meets the top of the flower cutting die to that halfway point on the bottom of the circle. So I run that through, and that cut the top left there. Now we need to do the bottom portion. I'll go from where the circle pencil meets the flower die on the bottom and cut that. Now all of the flower die has been cut only on the area outside of our trace circle. Now you'll see there's that pencil line on the center of the circle. I'll be able to erase that. But only outside of the pencil line did the flower cut. Now I'm going to take the circle die and line it up with my pencil circle. And we're going to cut this in one pass. We're going to go from where the flower cut line meets the circle die at the top and then also at the bottom. And we'll be able to cut all of that at once. So now we'll have this circle that's connected to our floral die cut. Again, you could do layering for a quicker card, but I really like to stretch my products by getting this new look. So now we have that one solid piece and we can do the stamping on it. By the way, you could do the stamping first for this process or after like I'm doing here. My next example will show doing it first. So I created 4 pieces like I just showed you. Now I'm going to do the stamping on them. I have the negative piece in there just to help me line it up and stamp in the same place each time. I'm starting with the outline image and stamping that with black ink. I then will stamp that with black ink on all of my die cuts, and then I will start filling in the rest of the image with color. So again, this stamp set has all the different pieces that you can put in to create different colors in the different areas. I'm doing 4 cards and using the same color combinations as I used earlier. So the nice thing is you have everything lined up. You might as well do multiple cards at once and try different combinations. So here are my 4 pieces. I just love that image. Now I did have some smaller areas left, these tiny little images. Some are the little blossoms and then some are little leaves. For those tiny ones, I usually just switch to an acrylic block to stamp those instead of using the MISTI stamping tool, whatever works best for you. For some reason, at this point, I think it's just quicker to use my acrylic block. For the background, I'm using a die I've used before. This is the Altenew Gradient Stripes cover die. What's fantastic about this die is these leftover strips, they are ideal for stamping on little stamped sentiment strips. So see all these leftovers? You can just stamp a sentiment on it and add it to your card. So you want to keep all those pieces. In fact, in the past, I've cut this die from white cardstock and kept all of the little strips so I would have them ready when it's time to do a quick stamped sentiment strip. I like when the die gives you many options like that. But for this card, I'm just doing a tone-on-tone background so it wouldn't be too distracting from the element that we're adding to the front. I wanted my thinking of you sentiment to curve along the bottom of our circle. Here's a trick that I do. I just kind of lay it down in the area I want it to be. I close the door on my MISTI, and then I start to arch it on there. So watch, I'm just going to kind of turn it up and try to guess at how much of an arch I need to match my circle. Then I take the circle die and push it against it so that it matches the arch of that. So I'm pushing the sentiment against the MISTI door and the edge of my circle die, and now the arch of this goes against that circle edge perfectly. All right, so I'm going to stamp Thinking of You on the bottom of each of my circles. Again, I think this sentiment is discontinued, but there are many out there like it. So here are my completed cards. This one I did cream cardstock on a white background, and then I have the yellow ink for the flowers. I also added some yellow pearls. So this design is one that you could make many at one time, and changing up the color combination makes it more fun for you along the way. Here I did a medium blue cardstock die cut background against a light blue cardstock behind that. I think that soft difference in the background is just enough, but not too distracting from the stamping we added. I really like how this circle is one piece with the flower. They're connected. It just gives a really nice professional look, but you could definitely stamp and die cut the flower and glue it on top of a circle die cut. It will give you a more layered look. It's a very subtle difference, but I think it's fun to do these partial die cutting techniques to get a different look. Okay, my first 2 card sets that I've shown you show how to do the partial die cutting before the stamping. However, I do think in most cases, especially if you're only making 1 card, it's easier to do the stamping than the partial die cutting, and I'll demonstrate that with this set of cards. Once again, you can see how the flower and the label die piece are one and the same. Okay, for this one, I used the beautiful Altenew Build a Flower Triumph Tulip stamp set. It's a beautiful layering set that has 2 different size tulips and different leaves and some other little doodads. And here is the layering guide. I just wanted to show how it really makes it easy to figure out how to layer them together. Also gives some color suggestions. I want to make 2 different cards at once, one with one tulip and one with the other. Might as well do the stamping at the same time since I'm using the same color of inks on each. So all of the white cardstock that I'm doing my stamping on is the same size. So at the end, we'll have our images all stamped in the same spot. So I did the first layer with my lightest color of ink, and then I come in with the second layer, which is the slightly darker color ink. And I'm using the same color combinations from earlier. I did add in this coral color flower, my favorite color combination from Altenew. I really like it. It works great for these tulips. You can see how realistic these tulips end up being. After I did all of the tulips, I went ahead and stamped petals on each of the pieces. I did the petal in the same location on each of the 2 sets of panels that I've created. Okay, once the petals are done, it's time to do our partial die cutting. I'm using the Altenew Nesting Frames die set. I've actually used this one in a video before too. And this time we have our stamping done first. So I put the flower coordinating die around it. And now I'm putting the label die up against it where I want them to kind of overlap. And I'm tracing those pieces on there. Don't worry about the leaf right now. We're going to get to that in a moment. The partial die cutting is easy here. We're going to put the edge of our cutting plate to connect from where the pencil line of the label meets the edge of the flower die at both the top and the bottom. I'll run that through and that cuts the top of our flower. Okay, so now we can remove that flower die and we're going to take the leaf die. I line that up. Now we're going to do partial die cutting on the bottom. Again, lining up the edge of our cutting plate with where the pencil line meets the die on the top and the bottom there. Run that through, and now everything outside of that label pencil area is cut. Now we can do the label itself. I line that up with the pencil. We're going to do partial die cutting of the left first, going from where the flower cut line meets the label die to where the petal, or that's not a petal, that's a leaf, where the leaf cut line meets the label. So we're just doing each side at once. We start with the flower at the top, the leaf on the bottom, then the frame on the left, and now we'll do the frame on the right. I am cutting off the tip of my leaf here. The reason I'm cutting that off is I'm going to actually have this hang off the side of my card, so it doesn't matter anyways. And there you can see how the flower and the frame are one die cut. Okay, so I went ahead and traced the label onto each of my other pieces. This time I thought this was easier since the stamping was done. I just trace where I want the label to be, and then I can go and do the partial die cutting on each of them. So I just got a rhythm going and did the partial die cutting on all of them. It took me about 20 minutes for the different examples I did. Then I thought it was easiest just to use a marker to draw in the stem connecting the tulip to the leaf. And of course I did this on each of my labels. Okay, so now for the background, I'm using the Altenew Dotted Swirls Debossing die. This just creates a simple die cut pattern on our background. And I did that on white cardstock for each of our examples. So I glued each of those backgrounds down onto a colored note card that matched my stamping. I then added the label onto the card, and I have it hanging off the side, so I trimmed the label off on that right edge. I then added a simple sentiment on it. These are going to nurses at our local hospital, so I tried to use encouragement and thank you messages. Remember how I was doing two different tulip images? One tulip I positioned on the right side of the card, the other I positioned on the left side, as you see here. And again, I just took sentiments from different stamp sets that I thought were good for the occasion. I ended up making a bunch of these cards. Once you get into the rhythm of doing all the stamping at once, all of the partial die cutting at once, all of the background die cutting at once, all of the assembly at once, you get into a rhythm and they come together pretty quickly. And I do think that all of those little details are really meaningful in the end. On these three, I put a hello lovely sentiment. These are actually going to three ladies that are local who are doing a lot to get lunches to the kids that need them from school. And so I thought the sentiment was nice. And this is from the Hello Gorgeous Altenew stamp set. And on each of them, I scattered a few pearls or gems that match the flower. That's a really quick and fast embellishment to add to anything. And remember, when you're building your sentiments, you can mix and match different sets. So on this one, I took hello from one set and wonderful from another and used them together. Okay, so there is a way to stretch your products and get a different look and have some fun by doing partial die cutting. I hope you'll try this. It really does work well with a variety of stamps and dies, so hopefully you have something that would work. If you wanted to check out the different products that I used today, they are linked below. And a big shout out to Altenew, who is celebrating their 6th anniversary this week, so that's very exciting. If you wanted some other videos on partial die cutting, they are linked here in the middle. And I pray that everyone is staying healthy and safe and that you can find a little joy in crafting today. Take care and we'll see you soon.